Everybody is freaking out about the war in Ukraine. Putin has threatened nuclear retaliation against the West for allowing Ukraine to strike Russia using Western-supplied missiles. This was one of Putin's red lines, and he recently changed Russia's nuclear doctrine because of exactly this issue. With Ukraine now striking Russian territory using ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles, Russia can view this as a joint attack, aided by nuclear powers. Putin could technically interpret this as a reason for a nuclear strike, although this option is purposely left in between the lines. Obviously, if this nuclear strike ever happens, everyone is done for. But it's worth looking at how serious the Russian nuclear threat actually is. Who is it pointed against? And could the US and NATO defend themselves against it? Or more precisely, how many nuclear missiles can they shoot down? Now first, like always, be sure to hit the like button down below. It helps us out tremendously with the reach of this video. Thank you. Okay, so before we dive into this, we don't want to make this a doom and gloom video. What Putin is saying is almost definitely an empty threat, especially when he's threatening NATO members. Launching a nuke just makes no sense from a game theory perspective, at least at other nuclear powers. If Russia sends its whole arsenal at the US, UK, and France, it will receive a similar amount of nukes back, killing 99% of Russians. If Putin is somewhat of a reasonable actor, he won't do this. Now, people obviously have mixed opinions on how reasonable he is, but we do know that Putin cares a lot about his supposedly grandiose legacy. Starting a nuclear war is most likely not on his agenda. Also, due to the way the Russian nuclear doctrine works, Putin can't launch nukes all by himself. After he gives the order, either his general staff or some other Russian officer needs to agree with him. This is called a dual key system. If these people don't want to, they can just simply refuse to launch the nukes, which is a very likely scenario if they love their family and have a will to live. This is yet another reason not to be overly alarmed. But if we're the devil's advocate, and say it does come down to a nuclear war, how would this play out? Would all of Russia's nukes hit America and European soil? This topic is actually pretty complex. First, we need to break down exactly what types of nukes Russia has because there are huge differences. Russia has 5,580 nuclear warheads, of which 1,710 are estimated to be currently deployed. This is a similar number as the United States has deployed at the moment, but there's more to it than that. The warhead itself isn't what makes one nuke scarier than the other, it's the delivery method. Arguably, the most dangerous type of nuke is launched by an intercontinental ballistic missile, an ICBM in short. They can be launched from the middle of Siberia and head towards the American or European continent. ICBMs have 3 phases, starting with a booster phase using a multi-stage rocket. The remainder of the missile then exits the atmosphere and travels to the target during the mid-course phase. At the terminal phase, the nuke heads straight towards its target with speeds of up to 20 times the speed of sound. Because they travel above the atmosphere, Russian ICBMs could reach Berlin, Paris, or London in like 10 or 15 minutes, and New York, Los Angeles, or Houston in 20 to 30 minutes. Right now, Russia has a little over 306 ICBMs. It has multiple versions, the RS-24 Yars and the RS-28 Sarmat being some of the most modern ones. However, the thing to keep in mind is that these ICBMs don't just launch one nuclear warhead. One intercontinental ballistic missile can carry up to 10 nukes and 40 decoys, which can overwhelm and distract defenses. That's why the little over 300 Russian ICBMs can carry almost 1,200 nuclear warheads. The nukes are first carried by a so-called missile bus during the mid-course phase, and then separate from each other independently depending on their targets. It's not the only capability to be afraid of, though. Russia has several submarine-launched ballistic missiles, also known as SLBMs. It's estimated to have 10 operational SLBMs and 160 of them in total. They're not all deployed simultaneously due to the high operating costs, but they can theoretically launch 800 nuclear warheads. So that's enough to destroy the whole country. SLBMs can be launched from nuclear-powered submarines, which creates an element of surprise. The angle at which the ballistic missile is shot matters a lot if you want to intercept them, so your chances with intercepting SLBMs are significantly lower than with ICBMs. The submarines can also get relatively close to enemy territory, giving them less response time. Russia's intermediate-range ballistic missiles, or IRBMs, also deserve to be mentioned. They have a range of less than 3,500 miles, or about 5,500 kilometers. Recently, the first Oreshnik IRBM was fired at Ukraine, as we'll talk about this later. This missile is able to carry 6 nuclear warheads with 6 submunitions. But IRBMs are only a potential threat to Europe and Ukraine, and perhaps Alaska. They're also much easier to defend against compared to ICBMs, with Israel shooting down dozens of Iranian IRBMs as a prime example of this. Intermediate-range ballistic missiles simply have lower speeds, which makes intercepting them a lot easier. However, Ukraine doesn't have the weapon systems to shoot them down. The rest of Russia's nuclear arsenal consists of strategic bombers and cruise missiles, although they're less practical against advanced air defenses. Strategic bombers like the Tu-160 are easily detected, and nuke-carrying cruise missiles like the Kh-102 are easily shot down due to their relatively low speeds. More threatening are the nuclear technologies that Russia is working on. In 2018, Putin announced the development of 6 nuclear weapon systems, properly named the Russian superweapons. The most threatening one is the Avangard Hypersonic Glide Vehicle. This is a type of re-entry vehicle for an ICBM that's able to maneuver in flight while reaching speeds of Mach 27 to 30. When it's functional, it's basically impossible to shoot the nuclear warhead down during re-entry phase. Other weapons in the program include a nuclear-powered cruise missile, an unmanned nuclear-powered and armed submarine, and new ICBM dubbed the Satan II. Now, all of these things sound very threatening, but how effective and realistic they are remains to be questioned. The recent test of the Satan II ICBM turned out to be a catastrophic failure. The booster either failed to ignite or there was some other mechanical failure, and the ICBM never got further than the launch site. The Sarmat missile was supposed to be ready years ago, but it's still not finished. So for now, the threat posed by Russia is comparable to the threat posed by the Soviets in the Cold War. But you'd think that during the last few decades, America's missile defenses have gotten a whole lot better. The people in the Pentagon have been constantly working on and investing in missile defense, ever since the first Russian ICBM launched in 1957. The basic challenges of missile defense haven't changed since, so let's take a look at how this defense technology has evolved. The first problem that needed to be solved was identifying and tracking the missiles potentially carrying nuclear warheads. This was very hard to do at first, but with the combination of ground radar and satellite technology, it worked. The Missile Defense Alarm System, MIDAS in short, was America's first early warning satellite system providing real-time infrared data. It didn't work like it intended, but it was able to spot Soviet ICBM launches. The satellites worked together with 12 radar stations spread across America, the North Pole, and Europe. There were many iterations of satellite and radar systems, but the basic idea stayed the same. The second step is obviously eliminating the threat, which is multiple times harder than actually spotting it. In order to stop an ICBM, you need an interceptor missile. People often describe this as stopping a bullet with a bullet. You have to get the timing and angle exactly right. And at speeds of more than 10,000 miles per hour, this becomes very precise. In fact, this is many times faster than actual bullets. The window of time where you can fire the interceptor is also very limited. Still, this didn't stop the US from trying to create a missile defense system. The first anti-ballistic missile the US developed and tested was the Nike Zeus missile, created in the late 1950s. Back then, they had the interesting idea to stop nukes with nukes by exploding a nuclear bomb right next to the other nuclear warhead. The upside is that you can be off by a few hundred meters or even a few kilometers, depending on how big of a missile and how big of a nuke you put out there. Russia still operates some nuclear-tipped anti-ballistic missiles, but back then, the problem with interceptors was that the Soviet Union was so far outproducing the US. It's easier and cheaper to manufacture ICBMs than interceptors, because the ICBMs don't have to target a moving object and require much less advanced technology. Critics of the Nike Zeus program said it's easier to just build more nukes, so that they could guarantee mutually assured destruction. This would lead to a so-called strategic balance, and hopefully both sides would avoid starting nuclear Armageddon. The US continued to develop anti-ballistic missiles, though, with the Spartan and Nike X interceptors as the next generations. But things took a turn in 1972. The Soviet Union and the United States agreed on an arms control agreement, which interestingly focused on anti-ballistic missiles. Both sides were producing nukes like crazy because they were afraid of the other side's interceptors. The United States had nearly 30,000 nuclear warheads at its peak, and the Soviet Union had almost 40,000. You'd say that this was overkill, but it had to do with some interesting mind games. The idea was that if the enemy can intercept your own nukes, it can strike you without any consequences. But by capping the amount of anti-ballistic missiles, the Soviets and the Americans would have no reason to continue their arms race, due to mutually assured destruction. So that's exactly what they did. Both sides were only allowed to have 2 interceptor sites and 100 interceptors max per site. Now, only a few thousand warheads will do for nuclear Armageddon. Sure enough, both sides started to reduce their nuclear stockpiles over the next decade. Still, US President Ronald Reagan wanted to take a second look at the anti-ballistic missile defenses. With his Strategic Defense Initiative starting in 1983, he wanted to put an end to the era of mutually assured destruction. He announced this plan in a nationwide television address. The idea was that a new missile defense system would render nuclear weapons obsolete. Billions of dollars of investments went into researching weapon systems that could shoot down nuclear missiles. And they weren't just researching regular ground-based interceptors. The initiative also included things like lasers, particle beams, and even space-based interceptors. This last item was why critics named it the Star Wars program. The idea was to put thousands of interceptor satellites in orbit, or even space-based lasers, which does sound like science fiction. Eventually, these things proved not to be feasible, at least not for the time being. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, nuclear defenses were also not on the top of the agenda anymore as the Cold War ended. People thought that nuclear Armageddon was a thing of the past, and they were happy to forget about it. Under President George W. Bush, the missile defense program shifted its focus. The goal was not to protect against thousands of ICBMs from Russia, but just a few hundred from smaller potential nuclear states. The Strategic Defense Initiative was scaled back, again mostly focusing on ground-based interceptors. During his second term, Bush pulled out of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty to expand the U.S. missile defense capabilities. He created the Ground-Based Mid-Course Defense System, the GMD in short. That's the pillar of U.S. missile defense to this day. It started after 9/11 happened, and people were really afraid of attacks from rogue nations. It was acknowledged, though, that the system had no chance of defending against a large-scale attack from Russia or China. This has to do with the limited size and capabilities of the defense system currently managed by the Missile Defense Agency. Nowadays, the US is able to detect and track ballistic missiles pretty well, so that's not where the problem lies. It has a set of space-based satellites that provide precise infrared data in real time. Computers are immediately able to recognize missile launches, which was proven not too long ago during the Iranian attack on Israel. This information gets passed down to the command and control centers that decide on further action and direct the other radars. Forward radar systems of the Army and Navy and ground sensors in California, Greenland, and the UK then help to precisely track the missile. The long-range discrimination radar in Alaska, the sea-based X-band radar currently based in Hawaii, and some additional satellites then help to discriminate between decoys and actual warheads, which is the most technical part. All of this information is passed down to the interceptor system, but here's where it gets tricky. First, we have to go over how the current interceptor system actually works. As of now, the US has 44 ground-based interceptors, some at the Vandenberg Base in California and the majority at Fort Greely in Alaska. In the future, this number is planning to go up to 64. These interceptors have a multi-stage booster that delivers a kill vehicle to the atmosphere. Using its thrusters, the vehicle then moves to a collision course with the ICBM when it's in the mid-course phase. The problem is that it's very hard to hit an object going faster than a bullet. That's why the estimated effectiveness of one interceptor is just 56%. It will take 4 interceptors to get an effectiveness of 97%. That's still not amazing if the fate of multiple big cities depend on it. The 44 interceptors can really only handle a dozen ICBMs at best. This is only a credible defense against nations like North Korea, considering that each interceptor costs $75 million. That's not really a great return on investment compared to the cost of ballistic missiles. The US also has another interceptor system called the Aegis Ballistic Missile Defense System. It's deployed by US Navy warships and is able to engage ballistic missiles during their mid-course phase. Currently, there are about 50 warships with anti-ballistic missile capabilities, which is planned to be increased over time. These ships also have their own advanced radar on board to track the missiles. The Aegis system uses the Standard Missile-3 interceptor, which has less range than the ground-based interceptor, but is also just a fraction of the cost. The Aegis system has a big problem, though. It's designed to combat short and intermediate-range ballistic missiles, so it won't do a great job at engaging intercontinental ones. However, the most recent version of the Standard Missile-3 has been able to intercept an ICBM during a test in 2020. So Aegis isn't completely hopeless either. It's hard to give a percentage on this, but it's possible that the Aegis system could defend against a few ICBMs as well. But if Russia launches all of its 306 ICBMs, it's clear that the vast majority will go right through the GMD. There's one last layer of defense that could potentially hit the ICBMs during the terminal phase. This layer of defense is formed by the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System, or THAAD, the Standard Missile 2 and 6 from the US Navy Aegis system, or with US Army Patriot Advanced Capability 3 missiles. While they'll surely try to shoot the nuclear warheads down, they're not designed to intercept long-range missiles. They simply have too high of a speed as compared to short or intermediate-range missiles. Some estimates are that only 10 to 20% of the warheads are going to be shot down. In short, the US is not going to be able to fend off a large-scale nuclear threat from Russia, or China for that matter. The whole nuclear defense system was designed to counter smaller and less advanced threats. In the National Defense Strategy, it is specifically stated that the GMD is neither intended for, nor capable of, defeating the large and sophisticated ICBM, air or sea-launched ballistic missile threats, from Russia and the PRC. The United States relies on strategic deterrence to address those threats. Even though the Pentagon is transparent about the limitations, some people still criticize the missile defense program. The elephant in the room is the amount of money that it has cost thus far, and it's pretty shocking. The Missile Defense Agency is currently spending $5 billion a year. It has spent hundreds of billions on research and defense infrastructure thus far. Over the last 2 decades alone, $170 billion went to missile defense. Except for providing limited security against rogue nations, there's nothing to show for this money. The Union of Concerned Scientists have called the missile defense system a waste of money and a distraction. They also say that the effectiveness of interceptors is way lower than the military claims, because the tests were done in controlled environments. If you look at it cynically, the missile defense system is really just a way for defense contractors to make a lot of money off the fear of nukes. It's easy to say that you can never spend enough to protect against a nuclear attack, but it's not realistic. But, on the flip side, a large share of the missile defense budget is not being spent on outdated ground interceptor technology. Billions and billions are going to research and development of newer, more promising weapons. If this investment leads to improved missile defense technology, it was all worth it. Washington has very high hopes, and it eventually wants to be able to fend off Russian and Chinese nuclear attacks. In the 2017 National Defense Authorization Act, the US government removed the word limited from the stated objectives of the missile defenses. This means that it is not just there to defend against small attacks from North Korea or Iran anymore. So let's take a look at these newer technologies. The defense contractor Lockheed Martin was selected to develop the next-generation interceptor. It got $17.7 billion from the Pentagon for this, quote, never-fail weapon system. This never-fail idea was very optimistic, so we'll have to wait and see if it works out. But computer power and missile technology has improved over the last years, so we could see the accuracy of these interceptors shoot up. Lockheed Martin is also competing with Boeing and Raytheon to create a multi-object kill vehicle in a multi-million-dollar research program. The idea is to put multiple kill vehicles in one ground interceptor, making them more effective. They will all independently target the missile, increasing the chances of a hit. The cost of launching one interceptor with multiple kill vehicles is probably also cheaper than launching multiple interceptors, increasing the return on investment. Even more innovative is the new air-launched interceptor concept. With this more than $600 million project, the Air Force wants to mount interceptors on F-35 fighter jets. These fighter jets will then fly close to the enemy launch site and strike the ICBM during boost phase, when it's still relatively easy to hit the target. During launch, the ICBMs don't go as fast as a bullet, and it's also a bigger object because of the booster. In areas where you can get relatively close to the launch site, this has a lot of potential. Currently, the US has no boost phase interceptors, so this could be a massive game changer. And believe it or not, the Pentagon is still investing into the laser technology idea. It spent tens of millions of dollars on a project combining drones and direct energy weapons. The plan is to create UAVs with a powerful laser that can destroy a missile during the boost phase. In another project costing tens of millions of dollars, the US is trying to create space-based lasers that would be able to shoot down ICBMs. It sounds pretty crazy, but if it works, it will change geopolitics forever. The idea to create a massive space-based interceptor system is also not completely dead either. Previously, it was thought to be impossible to hit ICBMs with satellites. The system would require a fleet of 1,000 or more orbiting satellites just to intercept a single missile, according to the American Physical Society. This was financially impractical in the past, but there's a reason to think that this will change over the coming years. Elon Musk's SpaceX company is working on the Starship, a low-cost, reusable rocket capable of launching 100 to 150 tons to low Earth orbit. The cost of launching things to low Earth orbit is already going down exponentially because of SpaceX's Falcon rockets. With the Starship, launching 1 kilogram to low Earth orbit is going to cost about $10, according to the company. For comparison, the cost per kilogram was tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars back in the Cold War. So space-based interceptors could actually become cheaper and more effective than ground-based ones and add a powerful new layer of defense. Now we have a picture of what the US is doing with missile defenses. But what about the rest of the NATO alliance? For our listeners from Europe, the future is pretty bleak. In 2007, the NATO alliance started to build missile defenses in Europe, but the defense capabilities are very limited. The US offered a helping hand by setting up the Aegis system in Romania called Aegis Ashore. It will be able to respond to some ballistic missiles, but the range is limited. Recently, another Aegis Ashore site was set up in Poland, which helps in creating a line of defense. 4 US Navy destroyers with their own Aegis systems are also deployed in Spain. They can be relocated to the Baltic Sea or across the Mediterranean when needed. Europe has a shared command and control center for missile defense located in Ramstein, Germany. There's also a strategic early warning radar in eastern Turkey, combined with satellite intelligence. Putin was pretty mad about this defense system when it was created because he thought it would disrupt the balance of power. Still, some key areas in Europe are not defended at all. And obviously, if Russia sends a lot of ICBMs, no one in Europe is safe. The only positive news for Europe is that it will be able to retaliate in a nuclear war, so it has a credible deterrent. The UK and France have their own nuclear weapons, 225 and 290 warheads to be exact. Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Italy, and Turkey all house American nukes, about 100 in total. But just like the US, European nations don't only want to rely on strategic deterrence. They are trying to improve their ballistic missile defenses in the future. France, Italy, and the United Kingdom are working on their own interceptor missiles called the Aster 30 Block 1. But when we're talking about Europe, we should also talk about the country that's in the most risky situation right now, and that's Ukraine. As much as Russia can still hurt the US and Europe at this moment, the biggest threat isn't directed at NATO. This is simply because of the strategic deterrent of a nuclear-armed Washington, London, and Paris, making it unlikely that a first strike will ever happen. It's many times more likely that nukes will be used in Ukraine. Depending on how you look at it, the new nuclear doctrine, mentioning a joint attack aided by a nuclear power, is either directed at NATO or Ukraine. And unlike starting a nuclear Armageddon with the US, a nuclear strike on Ukraine can actually serve a purpose for Putin in the war. We're not talking about the city-destroying ones from the movies, but about the tactical, much smaller ones. They can have a yield of less than a kiloton to about 50 kilotons, which is only 1/1000th of the yield of the Tsar Bomba, the biggest nuclear bomb ever. The advantage of this is that it can actually be practical on the front lines. They can be fired as short-range missiles, artillery shells, or as seemingly regular munitions. But the impact is hundreds of times larger than normal, with the potential to wipe out entire chunks of the enemy's front line. There is inevitably some radiation, but it's more localized than the bigger strategic nuke, and some versions of tactical nukes are engineered to have a limited fallout. So tactical nukes won't permanently ruin Ukraine either. Russia is currently mass-producing mobile, nuclear, and radiation-resistant bomb shelters, which is definitely not a good sign. They can potentially be used to protect Russian troops against a nuclear strike on the front lines. The barrier for using tactical nukes is quite low. This is exactly why people have been afraid of them in the past. They can be used very easily, which normalizes nuclear technology and sends the world in a very dangerous trajectory. In Putin's eyes, however, tactical nukes might be the perfect revenge against the Ukrainian government that's teaming up with rival nuclear powers. The Russian president has already been hinting at their use in the past. In 2023, Russia announced that it would station tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus under Russian control. This is very close to Kyiv, of course. Putin gave his usual excuse, namely that the US was doing the same by stationing its tactical nukes in allied nations. And just a few months ago, Russia held massive tactical nuclear drills. This was directly after the first rumors spread about possible strikes on Russian soil using Western weapons. Recently, Putin took it a step further by firing an experimental hypersonic intermediate-range ballistic missile at the Ukrainian city of Dnipro. It hit the target, and there was nothing Ukraine defenses could do against it. But these IRBMs can potentially carry nuclear warheads, including these smaller tactical ones if Putin doesn't want to level whole Ukrainian cities. Earlier this year, Russian military documents from 2008 to 2014 were leaked, describing the threshold for using tactical nukes. It was lower than expected, and some of these scenarios in the documents could very well apply to Ukraine. For example, an enemy incursion into Russian territory was named as a reason for a tactical strike. With the Kursk incursion, Russian military leaders already have the basis for this. They are also allowed to use tactical nukes for containing states from using aggression or escalating military conflicts. Using them when the Russian military was at risk of losing major battles was also an option, so there are tons of excuses for Putin to go nuclear. The only thing that potentially stops him from using nuclear warheads, apart from the terrible PR it would bring, is the fact that Ukraine could also develop nukes. It already has uranium and plutonium supplies from its nuclear energy sector, which it could enrich to weapon-grade levels. Such a bomb would be ready in a few years' time, according to one estimate, or in just a few months, according to a Ukrainian think tank. People in the missile industry also said that Ukraine could make nuclear-capable missiles in a few years because it already has a domestic rocket industry. Zelensky has already been flirting with the idea, saying that his country either needs a NATO membership or a nuclear deterrence. He later walked back on this because that statement didn't land well with his Western partners. It would violate the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons and increase the risk of a nuclear war. Also, Russia will try to sabotage Ukraine's efforts if it tries to create nukes. Putin responded to Zelensky's statement about nuclear deterrence by saying that Russia will not allow this to happen, no matter what. Still, it wouldn't be the first time in history that Ukraine would be armed with nukes. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Ukraine inherited the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world with 1,700 warheads in total. The country didn't have the technology to maintain and operate them, though, and also had no interest in keeping them at the time. Leaders in Kyiv thought it would only create unnecessary tensions with Russia and the United States. Together with Kazakhstan and Belarus, Ukraine finally gave up its nukes in 1994 with the Budapest Memorandum. In return, it got security assurances from the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia. They promised that they would never use military or economic force against Ukraine, except in self-defense. Russia has, of course, broken this promise, starting in 2014, just 20 years after the document was signed. Because of this fact, people are questioning whether it was a smart move to give up nuclear weapons in the first place. Former US President Bill Clinton has recently said that he regrets the Budapest deal. But in the toxic geopolitical environment of today, there is no turning back. To wrap it all up, this issue of nuclear threats by Putin is more complicated than you might think. Nuclear bombs are technically defendable, but a wave of nuclear bombs will probably overwhelm NATO defenses, at least with the current defense technologies. The US is better off than Europe, though, as the European nations don't have the proper defenses. But probably Ukraine is the country most at risk from Putin's threats. The chance that Putin starts using tactical nukes in Ukraine is pretty scary, in my opinion. Let's just hope that there's no nuclear escalation and that the world keeps safe. As you guys know, today's geopolitical world moves very fast, and it's pretty much impossible to keep up with all the news. And that's why we've launched Global Recaps, a geopolitical newsletter that covers the world news in a quick and simple way. Every day we send out an email directly to your inbox that covers the most important world news that you can read in less than 5 minutes a day. Best of all, it's completely free, and you can sign up now by using the link in the comments or the link in my bio.